Have you ever looked at life and asked yourself, why are things the way that they are? Perhaps you've questioned the unseen forces that create the incredible complexity of life that we see around us. We're taught that life is evolving, and so it stands to reason that we are somehow always at the cutting edge of that process. And in fact, right now, you are actively participating in the process of evolution, right? Pretty fascinating. And when we look back in history, we can see that there are these very clear stages of things changing in radical ways. From the primitive hunter-gatherer tribal eras evolving into the agricultural modes of production, and from the Industrial Revolution into the modern information age. And now we're also on the precipice with the development of AI of another monumental shift in the evolution of life. So what if there was this underlying structure that explained why life is evolving the way that it is, not just on a broad scale, collective or planetary level, but also within the context of your own life? Now, such maps and models do in fact exist today, and we're going to be exploring one of them. If you're new here, welcome to Awakened Evolution. My name is Jasper Brown, and today's episode is going to be a deep dive into one of the most profound and powerful models that's ever been created for understanding human psychology, social conflict, spiritual development, and cultural evolution. And it's called spiral dynamics. I'm going to be taking you guys on a guided journey through the various stages or colors, as they're also known in this model. I'm going to help you to become aware of the shadows at each stage, so you can actually start to evolve yourself and use this map or this model as a means to inform your personal growth and development, as well as help you to understand and fill out and refine your worldview. And this applies to everything from a religion to politics to personal growth and development. Even you'll find ways to apply this to your business. And you'll start to see that this model, spiral dynamics, gives us this very powerful lens to see what is really driving people. It'll help you to see where and why we get stuck or people get stuck. And it's also going to help you to understand what your next stage of development is about. And therefore, you're going to be able to move in that direction faster because it's going to be clear to you what the next stage is. So today, towards the end, I'm also going to be giving some big picture insights and how we can really use models like this to fast track our development towards higher states and stages of consciousness. So make sure you stick around till the end for that. Let's start by understanding what is spiral dynamics. It's a kind of weird combination of words. It doesn't really mean, so it's not very obvious what it means. So let's start with the basics. Essentially, there exists out there in the world a number of different models or maps of making meaning in developmental psychology, and spiral dynamics is one of these. It's essentially like a living map of how human consciousness evolves over time. It was originally created by Clare Graves, and full credit to Clare Graves for this amazing work. And it was later expanded by Beck and people like Wilber, who sort of integrated this into their theories and frameworks for how individuals, cultures, and societies progress through distinct stages, which informs their meaning making and sense making over time. So each stage in these models really reflects a core value system, which basically just highlights what we are focusing on or what people find most important to them at different stages. That's what values are. It's like, what's most meaningful to you? The things that in your life that are most meaningful and that you spend a lot of your time focusing on, that's what you value the most. And by understanding what people's values are or what your values are, you can have a very deep insight into what's actually driving your behavior. And our values end up being a certain lens through which we are interpreting and relating to life. And as you'll see very shortly, when I go into explaining the different stages, you're going to understand why your stage determines and also explains the way that you behave. And there's very specific reasons and very specific criteria and features of each stage. So as we grow and as we develop, we have what's called a center of gravity. And it's rare that we'll ever be stuck in one stage. We have a spread across various stages, and we have a center of gravity that might be predominantly in one stage or two stages. And as we grow and as we develop ourselves, our center of gravity can shift, can move up. We can also regress and it might move down as we change our value sets in response to the challenges that we go through in life, as well as our education and what we're focusing the predominance of our time and energy on. So what makes this model of spiral dynamics unique is that it is developmental. So each stage, as we progress, builds on the previous stages, expanding in complexity. As we move up higher through the stages, we develop more empathy and our perspective becomes bigger. So higher stages aren't necessarily better, but they are more expansive and more nuanced and tend to be more inclusive. So the higher that we develop ourselves through the stages, the more we tend to understand. And if understanding is something important to you, as it is to me, that's why I do this podcast. And I'm really encouraging people who listen and follow this work to really focus on understanding, because through understanding, life makes sense. And when things make sense, we're much less likely to suffer, and we can somehow map out reality in a cohesive and integral way, which is very powerful. Spiral dynamics is also non-linear, so we can express different stages in different areas of our life. You might be orange in the way that you approach your business. You might be green in your parenting, and perhaps you're blue in your approach towards spirituality. And don't worry if that doesn't make sense at this stage. It will very soon as I go into the explanations for each stage. This model is also shadow aware, so every level brings different gifts as well as blind spots. So it helps us to spot the dysfunctions and limitations of each stage without necessarily demonizing them or demonizing the whole. And this turns out to be really, really important. It also has a certain universal applicability. So it can be used to understand politics, social media, relationships, religion, organizational leadership, as well as our own inner life and personal growth. And really, spiral dynamics is transformational. So just by understanding and seeing these models, it's going to help you to understand where you're at, where you're operating from, and you're going to gain a certain awareness. And as I've said many times before, awareness alone is very curative. Like, it will solve a lot of our problems just by becoming aware. So we start to gain the power to actually grow and affect change. First, we have to become aware of what needs to change, and then we're going to start making choices and making changes that actually move us in a certain direction. And we don't do that by shaming ourselves or lower levels or lower stages, but by integrating them. We want to transcend and include. So spiral dynamics is it's not about being better. It's not about necessarily being more evolved than others and then using this as a fancy way to inflate our ego and to gain a certain authority or superiority over other people, but rather it's about understanding the terrain of human consciousness or consciousness in general and equipping ourselves with a powerful map to navigate that terrain and to navigate it wisely. So it's important to note here, before I dive into an explanation of each stage, that the map is not the terrain. These models don't match up with reality 100%. But they do point very effectively towards certain truths, certain features of the system. And by having the map, we actually have something to guide our process, guide our understanding. So you won't find these neat little boxes and lines that I'm about to draw out there in the world, but you will start to notice how all of this stuff connects, and you will see reality from a vastly different perspective once you understand this. This is extremely powerful. I can't overstate how profound having this kind of map is for your own personal growth and development. It's radically changed the way I understand everything. So if that's your jam, buckle up and let's dive into the stages. So stage 1 is beige. Beige is all about survival, and it's a very instinctual stage of development. So the most basic level of human existence we're talking about here. Life is all about survival, and all of our focus is towards maintaining our survival. There's no room here at this stage for abstract thought or even a lot of self-awareness or self-reflection. Our actions are largely driven by instinct, like hunger, fear, the desire to reproduce, and the desire to secure what we need in order to feel safe, just so we can survive. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this stage because it's quite simplistic, but some examples that we can draw here are newborn babies who are sort of bound to their mother, and they don't have necessarily a distinction between self and other. They think at that stage that they are their mother is them, and they don't know how to make sense of the world because there's no differentiation, there's no ego yet. Some other examples might be people who are trapped in PTSD. They're frozen. Maybe refugees who are fleeing war zones, highly traumatized. Maybe this stage appears when societies collapse and there's a lot of lawlessness. And people are basically just scrabbling to survive and maintain the basics, the very, very basics. So really there's just the layers of identity are basically instinctual and very reactionary to the stimuli that they're faced with out there in the world. In terms of survival, one of the main ideas is to attach to others in order to get their needs met. So things like begging, scavenging, maybe black market bartering in order to survive. And when an individual or a collective is stuck at this level, there's not really much room for sense making. It's very animalistic. So that's beige. The next stage we go to is called purple, which is tribal consciousness. Tends to be focused around mythic or magical thinking and this represents about 10% of the global population. It's less than that in Western democracies, but worldwide it's around 10% of people. So we're thinking like the third world, rural areas. And in purple, this stage really speaks to a lot like the need for security. So beings at this level tend to belong to clans and these kind of small groups that provide comfort and security in a turbulent environment. So the best examples here are really nomadic indigenous tribes whose values and needs are really being met by seeking immediate safety in groups. There's a strong connection to family as well as ancestral tradition. And at this stage, it's very conservative because the world is seen as a very dangerous place. It's only one step up from very basic survival, and there's major threats around the corner that must be prepared for and anticipated and survived. In terms of their sense making, the world is full of spirits and magic. So rites and rituals are used to protect the tribe and connect to a sacred meaning. In terms of politics here, we're looking at things like tribal councils, indigenous government, or governance, let's say. The faith at this stage is things like shamanism, animism, ancestor worship, ritualistic kind of magic rites and rites of passage. In business, it's more like family-run trades that are passed down through generations, and there's a sort of initiation process from one generation to the next. And in terms of personal growth, it's rituals, charms, magic thinking to influence the outcomes that we want to find in the world. And relationships, we're looking at things like loyalty to the tribe, loyalty to family, which overrides our sense of individuality. There's a sacrifice of our individual needs and desires for the survival of the group. The quote that comes to mind here is like, we don't question our blood. And the shadows on this level are superstition, a certain conformity that's based around fear. So we have to stick to the rigid norms of the group. And because of that, there's an over-reliance on groupthink or ancestral authority. So that's purple. The next stage up is red. And red is known for egocentric power consciousness. This is really the rise of the warrior self, with its strengths and also with its drawbacks. So this represents about 20% of the global population, less in developed Western democracies. And really, red represents the rise of the individual ego. What I want, I'm going to take, and I'm going to take it by force. This stage is really about dominance, assertion, impulse, and immediate gratification. Power is gained by force, with charisma, or by whatever means necessary, with very little regard to the effect that it has on others. And this outlook sort of stems from seeing the world as a wild place, a jungle, in which the strong dominate and the weak serve. So exploitative kind of impulses rule and play a very major role in the consciousness at red. And motivation is driven by self-serving needs and interests around claiming power and using that power to upscale, usually through some sort of competition. Winning at all costs. Therefore, as a result of this, the ability to sort of foresee long-term consequences or the results of one's actions is fairly limited and often non-existent. And the examples here really sort of include dictators, tyrants, gang leaders. It's quite brutal. It also speaks to the way that cult leaders often operate through fear, manipulation, and control. On the business level, we see it playing out as hustle culture, business with very little ethics, like scam artists or pyramid schemes. And in the personal growth realm, it comes across as narcissistic. They're kind of self-help influencers who are focused on winning through domination. In relationship, it looks like possessiveness, controlling dynamics, cheating, jealousy, obsession, and domestic violence. The examples at this stage in history are people like Genghis Khan, the warlord, who had this very primal drive to conquest. From popular film, we can look at people like Tony Montana from Scarface, who has this raw dominance, ego, brutal kind of survivalism. We might look at maybe young Kanye West, or maybe still current Kanye West, who has this self-glorification and impulsiveness and a certain history of controlling, manipulating, and dominating others, particularly his girlfriends. And for me here, a prime example is Andrew Tate, this aggressive, hyper-masculine that's focused on power, dominance, and extracting value from other people. If you listen to his messaging, that's kind of primarily the rhetoric, which is packaged in a clever way, but looking deeper into it, you'll see that it's really based around this, and it comes with a major inflation of the ego. I've got 27 supercars. I'm worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I have so many bitches sucking my dick. There's a bravado, there's some very brash, egotistical, bragging nature. And there's a lack of empathy at this level. So the shadows here are narcissism, impulsiveness, arrogance, domination, and no or very little impulse control. So that is stage red. Then we go to stage blue. Stage blue is defined by authoritarian order. There's a certain mentality of conformism, and around 40% of the global population are basically in stage blue or around stage blue, or have their center of gravity in stage blue. It's a bit less these days in Western democracies, maybe about 30%. And in stage blue, the world is structured by rules, hierarchy, and a sort of strict adherence to absolute truth. It's based around stability, belonging, righteousness, and future rewards are the principal drivers at this stage. So order is seen as something sacred that has to be obeyed. And to go against the established order is something shameful and carries harsh penalties or severe punishments, like going to hell, or maybe social ostracization or public humiliation and shaming. Purpose and morality at this level come from obedience to the higher authority, which equals usually God, the law, or tradition. So being good equals being self-disciplined, and people at this stage, in stage blue, rely on a sense of duty, self-control, and strict adherence to scripture or doctrine or the established rules of law, or their in-group, as it's called. And this is used, the in-group's sort of worldview is used to establish and interpret their place in the world, as well as their sense-making. So most of the world's sort of traditional religion falls into stage blue. Here we're talking about evangelical Christianity, Orthodox Islam, Catholicism. From a political level, we look at sort of conservatives, the right wing, authoritarian regimes. All of these organizations that really focus on obedience, hierarchy, and moral certainty. And at this level, it makes a lot of sense, and people need this because this is what provides structure and meaning and something reliable to hold on to in an uncertain world. And at the same time, because of this, it can reject nuance and suppress individuality. In business, it looks like hierarchy, bureaucracy, top-down leadership, this kind of thing. And in personal growth, it looks like living by certain fixed rules and conforming to the group. And there's this sort of guilt-based morality that plays out. If you do the wrong thing, you're basically kept in line, because if you step out of line, you're going to be faced with demonization by the group that you're a part of. So the code is like loyalty to the in-group and demonization of the out-group. It creates a very rigid, clear us versus them dynamic. In the relationship sphere, stage blue looks like traditional gender roles, patriarchal rule, we could say, or religiously sanctioned structures. So the prime example here is the Catholic Church or the Vatican. Rigid, traditional morality following the scripture or the Bible, and living with faith. So we can also see this in sort of military leaders and disciplined institutions, all kind of conservative religious movements, the evangelicals, fundamentalist Islam. These are prime examples of stage blue. And we can also see people like Jordan Peterson, who has a real emphasis on personal responsibility, order, traditional values. Now, Jordan Peterson is a bit of a special case here because he has a certain predominance in blue, but he also has access to higher stages as well because he's developed. He has a very good psychological understanding, and we can see that he actually has a shadow with stage green. He rejects the postmodernists, which I'll explain more in a little bit, and that will make more sense as we go further. The shadows here at stage blue are being dogmatic. So if we stick to a religious doctrine, we tend to become ideological and dogmatic about it. There's a shadow of authoritarianism, so imposing our rules on others, using guilt and shame to repress certain aspects of ourself, and using judgment and demonization of differences to enforce a certain superiority over others. The shadow here at stage blue is really preaching love and goodness and truth and the words of faith, or the Bible, for example, but failing to truly embody it, and in some ways being corrupt. And if you look into the world, you see a lot of people of faith praising God and saying, God is love, and live like Jesus, but then they go out there and they will demonize and shame and be violent towards other people who don't hold that faith. Or anyone who's not of our faith is condemned and is going to go to hell. And stage blue was a very necessary stage of development for a lot of human history. People needed to evolve, faith and a sort of strict adherence to authoritarian order in society was necessary, very, very necessary. At a certain point, the church and state were wedded together. And that marriage created a very potent sort of foundation for society to evolve. And that's why we see it still as a very predominant force in the world. And that speaks to a lot of conservative values. So conservatism is like really understanding that there's value in tradition. And this is what Jordan Peterson is talking about a lot. Let's not forget the value of the past and the things that we've held sacred and that have helped us to get to this stage. Let's not just do away with these axioms and sort of resources that inform our moral development, like the Bible, for example. There's wisdom in the Bible. Let's not forget that. And if we compare that, the reason we shouldn't forget it is because look where the world is going. Now there's anarchy. There's social, it's a jungle, it's becoming crazy. And let's not forget the lessons of the past. Because history shows us that things go to shit and we need to be prepared for that. That's the conservative sort of directive. That's the motivation that leads people to lean conservatively because there's safety there, right? So that's blue. And now we move into stage orange. Stage orange is really centered around scientific achievement. We could say it's the kind of strategic modernist, and it represents about 30% of global population. In the Western democracies, it's about 40%. So this is where the center of gravity of the West sits, whereas globally, the center of gravity sits still in blue. But Western democracies tend to be a little bit more developed. And this is where that development really starts to show, because our center of gravity here in the West is in orange. And in orange, the self awakens. Our sense of self starts to develop as a rational being. So we're moving away from religion. We're moving away from the church and these kind of rigid authorities and hierarchies based on faith. And we start to embrace rationality and science instead. Life becomes a game of success and achievement and personal agency. And the core values are science, reason, rationality, and material progress. So advancing our personal career, for example, these kind of things take center stage. The orange worldview is one that values self-reliance, freedom, and individualism, and we see that a lot in the West. It's like you can redefine yourself. You can basically make anything. You can make yourself into whoever you want to be. The world is your oyster, as long as you put in hard work and study, and play the game intelligently. It's like the great American dream, basically. From a political lens, we see this as libertarianism, neoliberalism, capitalist kind of democracies fall into this. Faith at this level, obviously being scientific and rational, it's less about traditional religion. It becomes more about secular humanism, atheistic kind of values, rationality, logic, reason, and in many ways, the religious traditions have been replaced by the church of science. So we see people adopting science as a belief and having almost a blind faith in science and scientific institutions and universities. So it's interesting to observe that tendency to want to believe and to want to cling to certain institutions in order to outsource our sense making and our worldview, it doesn't disappear when we transition from blue. It doesn't go away, it just changes. In the business world, through this lens, stage orange looks like Wall Street, Silicon Valley, startup culture, and meritocracy. The idea that anyone can pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. In the personal growth space, it looks like life hacking, performance coaching, biohacking, and a certain obsession over productivity. In the relationship space, it looks like transactional dating, pickup artistry, and marriages or partnerships that are made strategically. There's a very sort of transactional nature to everything at stage orange because there's a constant optimization looking to take place. It's like we're trying to extract as much value. It's very capitalistic. So some prime examples of people at stage orange are Elon Musk, who has a certain visionary entrepreneurship, very focused on progress, and a certain valuing of the elite. We have people like Bill Gates from the Microsoft era, who was very focused on optimization, logic, scale, business innovation. We have people like Tony Robbins, really focusing on personal growth through enacting a kind of strategy of excellence. We have women like Sheryl Sandberg, the whole sort of lean in philosophy, this career empowerment kind of mindset. And we have people like Sam Harris, who are very sort of atheistic, scientific materialism, even if it is mixed with a certain flavor of esotericism, like his attitude towards meditation. There's a sort of integration there. And we have people like Neil deGrasse Tyson, who are these kind of like hard-nosed materialists, scientists. These kind of types are very clearly stage orange. And I would also put Donald Trump in stage orange. The whole kind of like wealthy 0.01%, the elite, so to speak. And Trump is an interesting case, I guess, because he is also kind of piggybacking on conservatism and stage blue. He speaks a lot to, Christians, and has garnered a lot of a fan base from speaking to conservative values. But at his core, he is like toxic stage orange. He just wants to extract as much wealth and personal fame and power from being president. And so the shadows here are really materialism, out of control, a kind of never-ending hunger for more, 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 more. Another shadow here is that science is the best. Epistemologically, it's the best lens for finding truth and making sense of reality. And people tend to follow science blindly. So there's a blind faith component here, which can be a big shadow. And we look past all of the corruptions, the limitations, the biases, and the limits of science and materialism and capitalism. So there's a kind of an idea here, or a belief, a misguided belief, that science will answer all the questions and capitalism can solve all of our problems as long as we just keep progressing. It's like endless progress. That's the way out of all of our problems. So that would be what we call sort of toxic stage orange. And we can see that at the moment in the world. We see a sort of voracious, never-ending appetite to produce more, to grow more, to be more, to just like push the debt further down the line and keep extracting as much wealth as possible. If we can just keep producing, everything's going to be fine. Even if we have to push the cost on future generations. And there is this, at the moment, there is this huge gap in wealth worldwide. Like the top 1% or 0.01% have more wealth in America than the bottom 50%. And so stage orange is being pushed to the limit where it's becoming toxic, and it's starting to feed back into the system, and it's like the externalities are being pushed into the global commons somehow, into the environment, into the oceans, back into the culture, into the lower class citizenry of culture. And it can't last forever. It can't sustain itself. Some other shadows here are burnout. There's a manipulation. There's a sort of reliance on manipulating and covering up the truth. There's a lot of corruption that happens at this level. Spirituality is often bypassed or denied through logic, and there's a kind of fantasy or infatuation with the ego. There's an obsession for success. And an interesting point to notice here is that because the center of gravity of our culture is centralized in stage orange at the moment, we, as citizens of that culture, get a free ride up to this level. Our education system, the schools, the university, the culture basically brings our sort of young people up to that level. But the problem with that is that because our center of gravity is here, it also creates resistance to moving further up the spiral towards higher stages, because our ego and our collective ego structures in society, they're actually afraid of change. They resist change. Conservatives and people at stage blue don't want to change because change is a break away from tradition, and tradition is what has kept us safe. So why would we change? If it isn't broken, why don't mess with it? Don't fuck with it. And we can see this within the widespread embrace of sort of scientific materialism aligned with mercantile capitalism as the sort of predominant mode of production in our society. There's a kind of like contraction there. And it's hard to break away from it. We're almost like addicted to this stage that we're in because it's serving our survival. And especially for the people who are doing well, it's working brilliantly. But not for everyone, especially for minority groups and people on the lower end of the society. It starts to become clear that endless production, endless success, endless materialism isn't going to solve all of our problems. And this is going to make a lot more sense when we go to the next stage, which is stage green. And stage green ultimately really only starts to emerge when a culture or society has enough harmony, safety, and abundance and education. And you'll see as I explain this, stage green is starting to emerge. So green is really a certain form of pluralistic humanism. It's an awakening of the heart, and it represents about 10% of the global population, maybe 15% in the West. And at stage green, humans start to develop more empathy. They start to be more inclusive. They start to be more emotionally intelligent. The prevailing idea in green is that all voices matter. So where stage blue was kind of pre-modern, stage orange is modern. Green is really speaking to the postmodern philosophy. in which the conventional ways of doing things are challenged, the systems of oppression are criticized, and community healing and diversity are celebrated. And by ensuring that the common good and the equality of all people is prioritized, this stage starts to break away from traditional hierarchies and more towards an inclusive world-centric or ecocentric identity. So with that in mind, we can see that green really only became possible when we started to have a global culture. And it's a shift away from the kind of individualistic kind of thinking and more towards a thinking about, understanding we are one world, we're all part of life, we're all sharing the planet, and let's make sure we consider that. It's less about America versus Russia, Japan versus China. It's not so nationalistic, and it becomes more global. So in terms of politics, green represents the progressives, the activists. Probably the epitomization of green is the Greens social movement, the political movement. Political groups and parties that really started fighting for the environment. And more recently, it's become more about social justice movements, identity politics. And green as a stage really started to emerge in the 60s when we had the kind of hippie counterculture bubbling up to the surface. It was very anti-war, anti-government, and there was this kind of fierce opposition starting to appear at a grassroots level to combat this very capitalistic, nationalistic government structure. People were sort of growing tired of this, and especially when we had the early missions into space, when we started to get these, like the blue marble photo that came back of the Earth for the first time viewed from space. This marked a shift in global consciousness. People started to see, oh my God, look at that, look at Earth. All the borders, you can't see the borders from space. We're all sharing this beautiful island, this oasis in the middle of this infinite expanse of space. Why can't we all get along? Why is there so much war? This is so stupid. How can we be so ignorant and dumb to be fighting amongst ourselves when, we're all we've got somehow? And this is where we really start to see the kind of cultural resistance to moving up stages, as I've talked about. Our center of gravity brings us up to orange, but it also keeps us stuck. Because this kind of change, it's scary for conservatives. And it really typically appears in Western democracies, especially where we have a lot more education, a lot better standard of living, and people at Green want to get that message out to the world and say, let's stop doing things the way that we've been doing because we're hurting ourselves. But those who have not had the same amount of education, or perhaps have grown up in a more traditional or conservative way, don't have the same open-mindedness. They're not as willing to break things in order to make them better. And they don't, there's a fear around that kind of change. People at Stage Orange, the Wall Street business types, the tech oligarchs, they don't care about the environment. They just want to make their money. They want to buy more yachts. They want to buy more mansions. They're interested in next quarter's, profit share or revenue for shareholders. And Stage Blue don't want to consider the limits of their faith or their religion, and they stick to that because it's familiar and it keeps them safe, and it's what they use to make sense of the world. So we can see how all of these stages start to oppose one another. They start to conflict. They're rubbing up against each other because their values are different. They prioritize different things. In terms of faith at the green stage, we're talking about New Age, the whole New Age thing, New Age spirituality, eco-spirituality, or interfaith movements that are kind of blending different traditions and faiths and religions. Green really also epitomizes what we would consider as woke culture. So the whole woke thing that you hear about online, all this sort of progressivism, the Me Too movement, the trans and LGBTQ, all kind of like Black Lives Matter, racial equality, all these kind of things are very green. And even just understanding this changes the way that we relate to all of that, because, you know, it's very easy to demonize the radical woke kind of left and see them as just reactionary and ridiculous. But through this lens, we actually see that it actually takes quite a lot of development to even get to stage green. The amount of development it takes to be open-minded enough to consider those things isn't something just to be laughed at and trifled with. It actually represents a really important stage of development, even though it also has its limitations, and we need to be aware of those limitations because it can go too far. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a second. So in terms of business, green looks like value-aligned startups, diversity, and ecological initiatives. There's a blossoming of awareness into different ways of doing business, more inclusive, more informed, a bit more conscious business, we could say. In terms of the personal growth sphere, we look at green as being trauma-informed, healing-centered, non-violent communication, this kind of thing, inner child work, therapy. A lot of this, you know, emerging, especially in the online space, and it's been really one of the great gifts of the tech age is we've become a planetary society, and we're suddenly exposed to vast amounts of information that was previously impossible to reach, you know, very limited, very restricted, and now it's all at the touch of our fingers. And so there is a growing sense of these spaces and these things becoming more globally accepted. And, you know, as we evolve, that's more conscious, essentially. In the relationship sphere, green looks like polyamory, conscious relating, honoring and developing safe spaces, and seeing relationships through the lens of growth. In orange, it was more transactional. In green, it becomes about healing and growth, mutual support, empathy, emotional intelligence, all of these kind of things. Some sort of popular and famous examples of people at green are Brené Brown, who speaks a lot about vulnerability, empathy, working with shame, this kind of thing. We have people like Greta Thunberg, who is this kind of young climate activist with a certain emotional and moral appeal, speaking to, you know, the planet, basically, calling for a more environmental, egocentric approach. We have, as I mentioned before, the woke left, which comes in both its helpful and also its extreme forms. We have people like Bernie Sanders, who sort of appeals to this certain form of democratic socialism, which is basically opposing the excesses and the inequality of orange or toxic orange that we're in. He sees it and brands it as this kind of like uber capitalism gone too far. And he's very right in that regard. The shadows of stage green become things like moral superiority. So there's this idea that, oh, we're more conscious than you. Sort of, how could you not understand? Oh, you still care about faith and religion, and all you care about is money. How stupid, how unconscious, how ignorant. So green can be very kind of put on an air of superiority because of their development. There's a emotional fragility that appears at green, because when we start to develop this heart opening emotional capacity, it can also put us in touch with this overly sensitive kind of it can be naive. And this is what a lot of conservatives will speak to. Like, don't you remember what happened in World War I and II? That's not that long ago. The world can be a pretty fucked up place. And if we all go around talking about our feelings all the time and prancing around like a bunch of soy boys, you're going to get slapped by life. And we see this as well in the kind of in the woke culture, where people get criticized, or there's a conflict that arises, and there's an inherent sort of sensitivity there. And because of that, there's a certain avoidance of conflict or avoidance of proper discussion, and it will get shut down because there's an over sort of sensitivity towards criticism or critique. People at green are also kind of allergic to hierarchy or power, and that can be a problem, because there's an idea that we should dissolve all hierarchies and take the power away from the elite and give it all to the people. And there's a kind of naivety there. Like, hierarchy exists, and hierarchy plays a crucial role in the structures of society. It's necessary when we have populations that expand beyond a couple hundred people. We need hierarchies in order to make things run. That's just logistics. It's how humans have always done it, and it's also how it works in the animal kingdom. So green tends to go too far with its open-minded approach and mindset towards society. And we see this really clearly at the moment with the kind of radical woke left. We see it with the trans movement at the moment. And it's important to acknowledge that there are very valid truths here. Like, yes, gender is a social construct. It's something that we as a society have created and agreed upon, but it has been there for tens of thousands of years, and people aren't just going to stop using these constructs because a sort of a minority, a social minority, demands that we actually do so. Like, that's not just going to happen. People are going to oppose that. And basically there's a kind of naivety there that we can just go, rearrange things, dissolve things that have existed for tens of thousands of years that serve a very particular purpose. Like, they function, those constructs exist for a reason, because they help society to be organized. And they help people to create a sense of identity. And if you go messing with people's sense of identity, don't expect them to just roll over and change everything within a few years or a decade or even their lifetime. Like, the kind of transformation that we're talking about with the whole trans and LGBTQ movement is something that's going to take generations of people actually dying, because people don't like to change. And people see that, people instinctively, on some level, if you try to get them into this conversation, and this kind of radical woke culture will sort of bait and tease and provoke. But then when it actually comes to the discussion, when it comes to let's drill down and talk about facts here, the kind of discussion quickly turns to, oh, you're just transphobic, oh, you're shaming, you know, you're anti-gay, you're racist, or the discussion basically breaks down. And on some level that's kind of childish. Like, just because I disagree, or just because I have a different point of view about how things should be, or I have an opinion that is different from yours, it doesn't make me transphobic. It doesn't make me racist. And to insinuate that, or to, project that onto the situation, that basically shuts down the conversation. And so how can I take you seriously? So there's a certain naivety that comes there when the woke left, or when people on the green end of the spectrum, the radical kind of green end of the spectrum, go too far. And this is what Jordan Peterson is railing against. This is what conservatives rail against when they criticize the woke left or the postmodernists. So this is where we start to see the kind of important nuances here. And when we dig into the details, it starts to really help us to inform our sense making and to see why these battles are sort of playing out in online culture and in the world. And green is really still, even though there are major shifts in open-mindedness towards from a sort of ethnocentric, capitalistic kind of mindset into a global ecocentric value system, green is still very oppositional, very conflictual. People at green still see the world, and particularly stage orange and blue, as something to be fought against and opposed. So it's inevitable that there's going to be conflict arising, and there's going to be pushback. People aren't just going to roll over, and everyone's not going to go left. And these kind of delineations within culture between conservatives and progressives, that's something that exists in human history throughout the ages, because they serve very particular functions. The conservative mindset is like, bad things happen, let's protect against that, let's prepare for the future because things can go really bad really quickly, so let's stick to tradition and hierarchy and the rules of order and the land. And green is like open-minded, like things aren't working the way that they are. Not green, the left, or progressivism, is like, things aren't working the way they are, let's break it and see if we can find a better way. Let's be open-minded to changing things. And as we see it like that, both have value, both are useful, both play an important role. And the predominance there, the balance, is shifting and changing over time. So what is right-wing or what is conservative now would have been radically left 100 years ago. So these goalposts are changing, and what is considered to be left and right is evolving as humanity and consciousness evolves. So that is green. It's really important to see these stages sort of playing out, and especially these kind of stages of blue, orange, and green. This sort of explains a lot of the culture wars that we see in society. And now we go to a very important leap forward, which is what's called Tier 2. Tier 2 is a quantum leap in the development and state of consciousness within the spiral. And Tier 2 is quite rare. Tier 2 really represents only about 5% of the population globally, maybe a little bit more, maybe 7 to 10% in Western democracies at this stage. And Tier 2 represents a real qualitative shift in a person's development and state of consciousness. This is the first stage of all the stages that we've talked about so far that really develops the capacity to understand and make space for perspectives outside its own. So this is the first stage that starts to really understand and see the stages below it. In blue, orange, and green, they don't really see, or they struggle a lot to entertain and understand the worldviews outside of their own. And instead they resort to demonizing, invalidating, and fighting against them. And before tier 2, individuals really have a tendency to get trapped in their paradigm. They get trapped in their worldview, and they see their way of seeing the world as the only valid lens. And because of that, they have a very strong tendency to defend it. They need to defend it because they're wedded to it. They're fused with it. And so they do that by fighting and invalidating and demonizing the other stages and other worldviews. And that really goes a sort of very long way to explaining the polarization that we see in the online world, in meme wars, in the kind of internet battlefield. You know, if you go on YouTube or any of these kind of platforms with content, you see the clickbait titles like atheist debunks Christian, right-wing conservative smashes woke feminist, this kind of thing. And that's like a very simplistic kind of straw man version. They tend to straw man the opposing side instead of actually really deeply understanding other perspectives, even if they don't agree. So as we rise into tier 2, we begin to see the value of all the previous stages of the spiral without being trapped in any particular one of them. So we see the values and the limitations of the lower stages, and we can also acknowledge the necessity that they play, because every stage is valid, every stage is necessary, every stage is a foundation for higher stages. And in my own life, personally, I used to demonize religion because I was raised in a scientific culture. I was sent to university. My dad was a vehement atheist and would poo-poo religion. And I studied science. You know, I have a degree in science from my university. So I got to a certain stage of development where I would think that religion is just a bunch of relics from the past. It's a bunch of deluded people who believe in a big sky daddy who created the earth in 7 days. And that's really a straw man version, a very shallow understanding, just because it doesn't make sense from a certain point of view, from a rational perspective. And so stage blue was a shadow for me. And a little bit later on, I started to open up towards spirituality. I started to open up towards this work and start my healing journey, so to speak. And even then, I demonized and had a lot of resistance to the trans movement coming on the scene. I used to criticize that and think that it was a bit too much, a bit too excessive, because I didn't really understand the necessity that it was playing. And it was really only when I started to study developmental psychology that I saw why, these different stage conceptions, why they were conflicting, what they were about, and the necessity that they had. And now when I look at religion, I can see the limitations of it, but I can also appreciate what it brings. I can appreciate the necessity that it played in order to create the foundation for science and Stage Orange to actually emerge in the first place. And without that, we wouldn't be here. So tier 2 starts to acknowledge that every perspective is valid. Every perspective holds truth. But in order for every perspective to hold truth, not all perspectives are equally truthful. That's a crucial distinction. So tier 2 is comprised of a couple of categories, and the first one is yellow. So stage yellow is integral thinking. It's meta understanding, and it's systems thinking. Really, we're talking about a small percentage of the population, maybe 1% globally, maybe 5-6% in the West. And there's a real understanding of bigger picture, so systems thinking, which really looks to create integration, understanding the world through the lens of systems, complex systems that have very, very complex arrays of inputs and outputs. There's a breaking down of everything into systems. Like we have a body, we have a nervous system, we have a cardiovascular system, the medical system, there's an educational system, the environment is an ecological system, we have a planetary system, and everything starts to be broken down into these kind of lenses so we can understand the complexity and the integration of everything. Stage yellow has a deep appreciation for adaptability. It really prioritizes what works over the ideological purity that we've seen at lower stages. And at stage yellow, consciousness becomes more fluid. It becomes more nuanced. It becomes more contextual. And most importantly, it becomes multi-perspectival. So stage yellow starts to recognize that in order to develop an understanding, a big picture understanding, and to get closer to the truth, we need to see the relevant value in every perspective. And by adopting many different perspectives, we can start to actually map out and understand an integral or holistic kind of perspective. And that every perspective holds a little bit of truth. Maybe there's a kernel of wisdom over here in this religion. There's kernels of truth to be had in science, maybe big ones. Maybe voodoo, or some sort of rare, esoteric, spiritual thought system or philosophical system from the East holds a valuable thing that we need to understand and integrate. There's a sort of like welcoming and opening towards many different perspectives, which makes it much less conflictual. And that's why through this lens, we're able to see the lower stages of the spiral. We're able to entertain and understand the necessity of people at stage blue. We can see the inherent value and the role that religion has played in societal development. We can see the values and necessities of people at stage orange. And we can see and understand the desires of those at stage green for things to change. And all of this starts to be mapped out and become part of a cohesive web of understanding. From a political lens, stage yellow is transpartisan leadership. So it's less about bipartisan politics where one party, I'm a rigid Democrat or I'm a conservative. It becomes less about sort of sticking to those rigid boxes and how do we actually create politics that speaks to everyone or speaks to a large proportion of the population. And we can see that this is kind of rare in modern sort of political discourse. If you look online, it's very partisan. It's very oppositional. There's a lot of demonization and trying to humiliate and debunk the opposite side by strawmanning them. When I think of stage orange in politics, I think of Obama, a very skilled diplomat, very, very good at holding different parties and, creating resolutions that work for different vested interests. Obviously, there's a certain amount of corruption that comes with that position of power, which makes it difficult to really, for anyone to stay truly aligned with their values. But I believe Obama at his core was a very sort of tier 2 yellow stage politician. In terms of faith, we're looking at integral spirituality, a kind of fusion between East and West. There's a kind of merger between science and spirituality that starts to be happening at stage yellow, as if science and spirituality were two long lost dancing partners who are slowly coming back together. In terms of business, we're looking at visionary entrepreneurship, a certain regenerative approach towards the economy. How do we restore balance into a complex system like the global economy? It's extremely difficult to do that. And it's this kind of systems thinking that we need in order to actually understand it. It's not just like, Democrats are in for the next 4-year cycle, or Republicans won this time and that's going to solve anything. A systems thinker will look at politics as a system globally over, a 10, 20, 30, 40, 50-year time span, and look back in history 100 years and see what are the macroeconomics and large-scale systemic inputs that are creating the outcomes that we see today. And how can we account for that in making plans for the future in order to regenerate and balance resource acquisition and modes of production? In terms of personal growth, we're looking at things like integrative coaching that really blends different fields together, including things like somatics with psychology and also integrating spirituality to form a cohesive, big picture understanding of personal growth and development, which is really a lot what I'm trying to do here and in my coaching practice. In terms of relationships, we're talking about holding polarity, integrating polarity, the dance between the masculine and feminine, with depth and with sovereignty, without kind of rigidity, without a kind of fixation on sort of gender norms or this kind of thing. We can become more fluid than that. We can become much more nuanced. There's a masculine and feminine inside each of us, and why not let's balance those so we can learn to dance with the masculine and the feminine of our partner. We don't just need our woman to just be feminine, and men don't just need to be masculine. It's more complex than that. When it comes to examples from popular culture for stage yellow, I'm thinking about people like Joe Rogan at his best. I think he's also capable of being not so stabilized and embodied in tier 2, especially as the podcast has grown a lot and he's sort of started to farm and give sort of audience to whatever's going to draw the most attention. But his curious, sort of non-dogmatic, multi-perspectival kind of explorer mentality, I think, represents certain features of stage yellow. There's the Rebel Wisdom podcast and YouTube channel. People like David Fuller and Daniel Schmattenberger. These guys are very beautifully embodying stage yellow. I'd highly recommend checking that out. It's one of my favorites. We have people like Mo Gaudat, who are really sort of systems-minded, scale-oriented, future-thinking visionaries for the integration of AI into human culture, kind of spiritually grounded entrepreneurship. And we have people like Ken Wilber, who was the creator of integral theory, which is like Basically, it's in many ways similar to spiral dynamics, but I would say it's even better in terms of its stage conception and theoretical backing. It is much more complicated. It takes a lot of crunching to sort of understand and to really make sense of it. And I will get into Ken Wilber's work in the future and present that to you guys, so stay tuned for that. Ken's work is very, very profound and very beautiful embodiment of tier 2, especially, and stage yellow. In terms of shadows here at stage yellow, we're talking about an arrogance of awareness, intellectual superiority. There can be an over-analyzing component, kind of excessively intellectual, and it can sometimes come at the cost of compassion and empathy and embodiment. So it's almost like it can be too systemic, and it can become a little bit theoretical, a little bit ungrounded. And if you want to give a critique of Ken Wilber's work, it is that it is a bit overly theoretical, like it's heavy, it's dense. And I think that's one of the reasons why he hasn't or didn't necessarily gain the amount of traction and global exposure. It's kind of like developmental psychology for nerds, but kind of alienating lay people because it's quite dense and difficult to understand. And it's important to acknowledge that it's really something to aspire towards. We need to balance those shadows with the integration of multi-perspectivalism, because it's through seeing the valid truth in every perspective that we start to dissolve this idea that we need to defend our particular worldview. This is why tier 2 is a qualitative shift, because we start to put on and take off perspectives like a bit of clothing, like a hat that we're putting on. We just let me go spend some time over here and understand Nazism. There's a valid truth in Nazism. Okay, we can agree that it also went crazy and became excessive and even pathological. But there was some valid truths there. It spoke to a very real need of the German people at that time. It made sense within that particular time period from that political landscape. And it took hold and it birthed into what it turned into for very valid reasons. And it's important to understand what those were. There's truth there to be garnered from that. And there's valuable lessons and wisdom to extract. And let's look at Wahhabist Islam. And let's look at Christianity. And let's look at Judaism. And let's look at the woke radical left. And let's look at the progressive worldview and understand the democratic processes that are going on within politics and why there is such a divide in culture at the moment. Let's analyze everything and extract the wisdom. Let's use all these different perspectives that we can take on and off like bits of clothing to form a very comprehensive worldview that is radically inclusive. Because like that, by including all the different perspectives, we're going to have a much richer and more nuanced and big picture understanding of why things are the way that they are and why it all makes sense. And because of that, we don't need to be in opposition. We don't need to reject. We don't need to demonize or alienate anyone. What we want to do is we actually want to understand them. What we want to do is we want to make sense of reality. And we don't make sense of anything if we demonize, reject, or enter into conflict with it. So tier 2 becomes like a radically inclusive worldview that's really prioritizing deep understanding. And if you can bootstrap your way up to this level and really start to embody this and cultivate this, it's going to empower you in ways you can't even imagine. So that is stage yellow. And now we go into the final stage, which is turquoise. Turquoise is really speaking to unity consciousness. We could call this the stage of the holistic mystic. Turquoise is developing a global, cosmic perspective where reality is seen as something sacred, like an interwoven web. There is a deep coherence between everything, and a turquoise person is really centered in a life of service and purpose and soul-led action, which emerges not from a place of ego, but from a deep-rooted sense of being. And action springs forth from that place, rather than a desire to distinguish oneself. Because the sense of self at turquoise has expanded so much that it's including everything. And turquoise really represents this shift towards an understanding of oneness. So in terms of politics, turquoise looks like global consciousness movements, earth-based activism, even this idea of developing like a planetary council. Like we are one planet. Imagine we had like a Jedi council that spoke for Earth. Imagine a future in which alien civilizations are found and Earth is united as one single conscious species ready to explore the cosmos together and find and colonize new worlds, potentially. Through the lens of faith, turquoise really looks like non-duality. There's a sort of non-dual mysticism, we could say a lot of Zen Buddhism or non-dual sort of traditions, Advaita, Vedanta, these kind of philosophical systems and spiritual traditions really start to access and understand life and reality from the turquoise stage. We're looking at cosmic unity teachings and universal dharma, so an understanding that humanity is on this bigger path, a much bigger path, and where we are at the moment is just a step in a very long process of evolution that's occurring, the evolution of consciousness. In the business realm, turquoise looks like sacred commerce, conscious economics, and Tao-based innovation. So really sort of elevating our understanding of business into a place of deep spirituality, where it becomes not just a economic sort of mercantile exchange, but a profound spiritual practice for the evolution of consciousness and life as a whole. Because stage turquoise is really activating or understanding reality and life from a holistic perspective, our sphere of awareness, our sphere of concern grows to include all life and not just our little slice of life or our particular egoic needs and identity. On the personal growth side of things, turquoise looks like plant medicine work, devotional spiritual practice, dedicated daily sadhana, deep time in solitude, doing retreats, industrial grade meditation, like really, really plumbing the depths of your own psyche, your own consciousness, and your own mind in order to reach truth and higher wisdom. And there is a certain surrendering to the mystery of life. In the relationship space, turquoise looks like sacred union between the divine masculine and the divine feminine. Love becomes an act of devotion and prayer, sex becomes this sacred ritual of honoring and seeing the beauty and the divinity in our partner. Popular examples of stage turquoise include people like Eckhart Tolle, who really embody this presence and transcendence and spiritual integration, speaking to the power of now, seeing that this present moment is the gateway to understanding. We have figures like Ram Dass, who really preached for unconditional love and spiritual service in his very beautiful transmission. We have people like Sadhguru, who's really sort of done some amazing work with the Isha Foundation and his community, his conscious community that he's built. And we have people like Leo Gura from actualize.org. Leo's work is some of the most sort of profound teachings that I've found so far around this kind of turquoise level spirituality, understanding, God realization, sort of mining very deeply into epistemology and how we actually make sense of reality. And if you haven't found his channel, I highly recommend it. I learn tremendous big picture understandings and insights from actualize.org. So I really recommend that you integrate that as part of your content diet, let's call it. And in terms of the shadows here, we're looking at things like disassociation, spiritual bypassing, a certain spiritual elitism. When an individual starts to access higher states of consciousness and become, non-dual, so to speak, or to start accessing God consciousness, it's very easy for the ego to become inflated and to think, oh, I've transcended my ego, now I'm better than you. Now I'm better than everyone. No one understands God or spirituality or consciousness like I do, and that makes me better than everyone else. So there's a shadow there with this. Can also be prone to impractical forms of idealism, expecting that reality should change or people should change or, we need to evolve faster than we are. And there can be a denial of personal boundaries or individuation. So yes, when you have non-dual states, you start to notice that all boundaries are just imaginary and there really exist no distinctions that are real. It's just lines that we draw in our mind in order to fool ourselves that we're separate, but in fact, we're not. And that can come at the cost of interpersonal boundaries at the relative level. Even if at the absolute level it's true, it doesn't mean there isn't a certain importance and validity of boundaries at the personal level. In fact, they're necessary, especially if we want to have healthy relationships with people. I think it's also important to acknowledge that turquoise is the least understood stage because so few people are actually at this level that it's hard to compile data and to make really good examples of this. It's much more likely that people access states at turquoise. We have peak states on psychedelics or when we're meditating or, spontaneously we have an awakening. And so we access turquoise for a short period of time, but very few people are living at that stage. There's so much resistance to that stage in the world because we're at mainly stage orange and blue. And there's it's not very good for your survival to be at turquoise. It's difficult, it comes with challenges and very few people are able to really maintain it. And the world isn't that interested, It is in some ways, and in many ways it has been for many thousands of years with the ancient sort of, especially the Eastern traditions like Buddhism and Hinduism and, the yoga philosophy, Advaita Vedanta, these kind of things have known that these spiritual truths exist and have even mapped out a lot of these states and stages of consciousness. but so much of the world is in fierce opposition and doesn't want to know about it, doesn't care about it, it's not important. And through understanding spiral dynamics and these kind of models, we can understand why that is. It just doesn't pay. It doesn't serve our survival well enough. We're not there yet. I think it's also important to acknowledge that turquoise is a very complex stage that is somehow vast compared to all the others, and it would be split into several sub-stages at varying levels of gradation that can be explored and it can be discovered for those of you who have this kind of interest and aspiration. And as humanity and culture sort of evolves, in many generations from now, maybe thousands of years in the future, turquoise is going to be, there's going to be stages beyond turquoise potentially, or turquoise will become its own several stage model. So it's fascinating. And the more that you expand your consciousness and start accessing spiritual states and have awakenings, that's why awakenings are so important to train yourself to achieve, because they really give you a radical shift in perspective in a way that no other stage below really has access to, not even yellow. Yellow by itself doesn't really have a deep relationship with spirituality. Not in the absolute sense. So it's important to notice that and to see that we really want to start working towards having these kind of states and accessing these stages of consciousness, because it's really going to recontextualize all of the stages below. And we're going to make much, much faster progress as we move up the spiral. So in terms of real world applications, these models, they're not just conceptual. I know it sounds like that, but they're also diagnostic. So once you learn to see the spiral, and listening to this is a first step on that, you start to actually decode society, the online culture wars that we see. You'll understand relationships through a new lens. And you're even going to start to acknowledge and notice different aspects of your own inner dialogue. The voice inside of your head that is at war with itself, or different parts of you are in conflict, and it explains a lot the parts of ourself that aren't necessarily in harmony. And we'll actually start to see ourselves with much more clarity. For example, I see the parts of myself that were conditioned by my stage orange education, that still cling to rationality and materialism as a lens of making sense, because it's pretty hard to get rid of that. I went through, 16, 17, 18 years of education system that have programmed me in a certain way. And even though I'm starting to go far beyond that and I can see the limitations of science, I've deconstructed science and made sense of the problems that it has as an epistemic framework, I'm still living in a culture that is stage orange. So, and I've accessed non-dual states, I've had awakenings. And even though I've had those awakenings, I still come back down to a kind of a worldview that is rational, scientific, and materialistic. And I'm in the process of integrating that. And I think it will take quite some time. And I'm also really sort of seeing that tier 2 and stage yellow is something that I have a lot of work to do in. And I had work to do in going back into stage blue and understanding the necessity of, hierarchy and rule-based order and religion, to not just demonize it and strawman it, but to actually steel man those perspectives and see why so many of the people in the world are clinging to that and see the world through that lens. So I start to map out these different parts of myself and see how they relate, see where I'm stuck, see where I'm maybe still displaying certain shadows that I need to resolve and integrate, because my My mission is to become as integrated and as conscious as possible. And my proposition to you is that this is one of the most powerful things you can do. This is one of the biggest life hacks that we can actually develop, and it leads to a profound understanding and a profound experience of life. And before this, I was basically ignorant, evolving, but very unconsciously. I was interested, I even became interested in spirituality. I finished my science degree. When traveling around the world, I started to have early experiences with psychedelics that opened my mind to spirituality. And so I started going to India and searching for spiritual traditions and teachings and paths to help me explain what happened to my mind when I took psychedelics. And even when I found those traditions and spiritual paths, there were still things missing. I still didn't have the right map. I became ideological, I became dogmatic, I became a bit of a fanatic, and still made a lot of errors and had a lot of gaps in my sense making. And so I'm using these models to fill in things and understand things in a deeper way. Because before, I really couldn't, we hear a lot this term like to be more conscious, but I couldn't understand what that actually meant. What does it actually look like to be more conscious? How do I diagnose myself? How do I measure different perspectives? How do I adjudicate anything? And that's where the value of these maps and models like spiral dynamics come in. So we've walked through the entire evolutionary terrain of human consciousness, from pure survival and tribal belonging to power, order, logic, rationality, and then made the jump into sensitivity and inclusivity, and ultimately up towards integration and unity. And the most important thing that I want you guys to understand and take from this is that every stage matters. Every stage has shadows. Every stage has profound value, and every stage is 100% necessary. Most of the conflict we see in the world, politically, culturally, relationally, is one stage in conflict with another. Red attacking green, orange mocking blue, green rejecting orange. And we get stuck thinking that our perspective is the truth rather than a truth. But spiral dynamics gives us something extremely powerful, which is a developmental map, which is not supposed to be used as a hierarchy of superiority, but rather a pathway of increasing complexity, compassion, and capacity. And when you learn to recognize what stage you're in, or where your growth edge is next, or why it's triggering you, then you start to reclaim your agency. You reclaim your autonomy, you reclaim your power. And you stop fighting people. You stop creating opposition with people who are not wrong. They're just seeing the world through a different lens and a different set of values. And if you can learn to stop demonizing others and other perspectives outside your own and instead develop curiosity to understand them, you can start to integrate them instead of rejecting them. And then you get to learn to lead with love and to create from a place of depth and vision and radical humility. And that is something extremely precious. So that's it for this one. If this episode sparked something inside of you, if you saw yourself in some of these stages, or if this communication, conversation made you reflect on your relationships, your culture, or your past, or where you are right now, please let me know in the comments. I would love to hear from you. What resonated, what challenged you, what dots have managed to connect inside of your mind. And if this lit you up in some way, I'd love a review. Leave a 5-star review and let me know what you thought. I really read all of the comments and all of the reviews. They mean a lot to me at this stage, because this is my life's work and this is just beginning. It's just growing and I'm just at the beginning of it. So any support that you can give, any feedback is deeply, deeply appreciated. And if you're a man who wants to do this kind of work, not just conceptually, not just listening passively, but embodied and in relationships with others, then you might like to come and join my men's group where we practice this stuff for real and talk about it a lot as a group, as a collective, and support each other to be accountable and to actually embody this work. And I also guide men one-on-one in coaching to become highly integrated, whether that's in business, life, relationships, personal growth. Just step out of the unconscious, unhealed boy psychology and actually start to step into the embodied masculine leadership frame. So if that resonates, check out the links below and you can book a free call with me to see if we resonate, to find out if the solutions that I've created are a good fit for you and your situation. And lastly, I just want to leave you guys with a few big picture insights on all of this and how it fits into our work here at Awakened Evolution. So spiral dynamics isn't just a theory, it's a developmental mirror. It's a very powerful lens that's going to increase the magnification with which you see yourself and the world. It reveals how your mind, how your value sets, and how your identity evolves with increasing complexity as you become more conscious. And that is a very powerful thing to understand. It's also important to reiterate that the map is not the terrain. It doesn't superimpose directly onto reality perfectly, but it does give us a way to analyze reality in a very, very powerful way that leads to the discovery of profound truths. Each developmental level has its own version of God, truth, love, and power. Even stage orange, which is more atheistic, holds science as a form of quasi-religion and puts ultimate faith in it for sense-making and truth claims. So that's very useful to see. And there's also layers above that. And as we ascend the spiral, our perspectives expand and become much more inclusive and more holistic, which is a very powerful metric to measure a worldview. The more inclusive and holistic it is, the more conscious it is, right up till the non-dual states and stages. And by understanding that, we're really starting to expand and develop our ego's ability to make sense of reality, which is super powerful. It's one of the most powerful things you can do. It's one of the best things that you can focus on in your life, because it's one of the things that influences everything. It influences how you relate to life. Who you think you are determines what you think is happening here. And this is something that can be evolved enormously. From the scientific rationalistic kind of paradigm, it doesn't seem that way. We're not taught that it is that way, but it is that way. So it's really crucial that you understand that. And what we're doing, we're going from fragmentation and compartmentalization, where everything is split. And that's what science is very good at. It's compartmentalizing everything, splitting it up and trying to understand it. And the lower the stage, the more fragmented we are. And that's just a necessity of survival. But as we move up the stages, we're moving towards wholeness, towards non-duality, and beyond that, even into God realization and ultimate understanding at the highest levels. But here's the secret. The thing is you don't get to skip stages. It's very tempting to gamify this model and to try to claim yellow or turquoise. And I catch myself doing this frequently, and it's a mistake. Because consciousness doesn't work like that. You can't bypass any stage by jumping straight to oneness and love and light. But that doesn't mean you integrated or you truly understood what's going on here. Just because you have a non-dual experience, just because you had an awakening, just because you realized God or you had a psychedelic experience, doesn't mean you have good sense making. And if we don't have good epistemic frameworks, we're going to misinterpret the spiritual states and experiences that we have. We're going to make it mean other things than what it is. Now, we need to have the awakenings because that radically recontextualizes our view of reality. But then there are decades and decades of work in the integration and development stages. And that is really what's called spiral wizardry. The ability to relate to, embody, and deeply understand all of the stages. And to basically step into the worldview and the value sets at any stage and to make sense of it. You become a wizard of this shit. And that is very powerful. Because then we're basically removing any shadow that we hold, any part of reality that we're disowning. And another way of sort of thinking about this is that you fully awaken your consciousness through the spiral. Because the reality is that you are the spiral. You are the whole thing. Because the spiral represents the spectrum of consciousness. And you are it. Not just a part of it, but the whole thing, and the idea is to become conscious of that. And this is why this work and what we're doing here relates to awakened evolution. That's what this whole channel is about. Because real awakening, it's not just about peace, about presence, about non-dual awareness. It's actually taking care of your survival at beige. It's doing your grief work at purple. It's reclaiming your power in red. It's healing your shame in blue. It's redefining your success in orange. And it's opening your heart in green. It's learning to think systemically in yellow. And it's remembering who you truly are in turquoise. And this is how consciousness evolves. And that is what this work is all about. So we'll be taking this much deeper. I've got episodes coming in the pipeline on spiritual bypassing, on meditation, on epistemology, on the structure of the ego, on cult psychology, and a lot of stuff to do with awakening and how you can achieve that. So that's why this episode is foundational, because we needed this in order to properly set up those other episodes. And as you can start to see, the scope of this work is immense. And I'm really, really, really excited to evolve this with you guys. And that's why I really appreciate your feedback, because it helps me understand what you guys resonate with the most. So thanks for sticking with me. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you guys in the next one.